Merry Christmas, everybody. It is the final UFC event before Christmas, and hopefully we can end the year by putting another profitable UFC event in the bank. I'm very confident we will, because this weekend's card is another great card for betting, and as you can see, we make a profit on approximately 70% of UFC events. We also made a profit on last week's card in pre-fight betting. If you watched last week's breakdown video, you can see here the video, how good is Asakura. In that video, we spoke about how betting on the Doo Ho Choi versus Nate Landwehr fight not to go to decision was a very good bet. We posted it in the Discord, which you can see here. We also spoke about it in this video and had another winning week on pre-fight bets. We've had a pretty good run on pre-fight bets over the last few months. We hit a winner here on Carlos Hernandez to beat this guy whose name I'm not going to try and pronounce again because it was hard enough trying to pronounce it during the Yan Figueiredo fight week. We also had my personal biggest bet of the year on Jake Paul to beat Mike Tyson. He came through for us in a big way. We also actually shared that on YouTube. You can see here the video, I'm betting Jake Paul. We lost this bet. We lost the bet on the over 1.5 rounds in the Magny Prates fight when he got starched. But before that, we did pretty well on this card as well, with Jasmine Jasdovicius and Sergey City coming through for us. We also hit a nice winner on Elise Reed to beat Jessica Penne. So we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, we're 6-1 on our last 7 bets. So obviously been another profitable year on everything that we do, UFC and football. So maybe we can dig up some more bets in today's video. We will see. As ever, we will be taking a deep dive into all of these main card fights. To try and dig up some bets and to share with you what I found in the research. As ever, everything that I will be talking about in today's video is backed up by many hours of research and over 10 years of experience. I make a profit almost every week on the UFC. As you can see from this profitability chart, almost every month on the UFC. And that isn't going to change anytime soon. 2025 is going to be another great year for us. I am very sorry for another late upload, but you guys know me by now. My priority is betting on sports. I always say I'm not a content creator. My priority is betting on sports, making money betting on sports. And at the moment, it's such an amazing time for betting on sports. The UFC are blessing us with great events to bet almost every week. We've got another great card this week. If you know much about football, or you may call it soccer in your country, there's amazing football matches to bet pretty much every day of the week at the moment until the middle of March. So we're trying to make the most of that. And next week, we've got the World Championship of Darts starting. Now, depending on where you live in the world, you might not even have heard of the sport darts. But trust me, it is amazing. If you learn how it works, the games are high drama. It's one of the most entertaining sports you can watch, in my opinion. I absolutely love it. It's a bit of a Christmas tradition in the UK. We watch the darts at Christmas. Everyone gets into it. It's a big thing. So if you're bored this Christmas, check out the World Championship of Darts. I'll be live betting it as ever on my Discord channel. So if you're a member of my community, get involved. Come join the fun. Come join the party. In fact, I might create a separate darts Discord channel so that everyone knows where to come and find it. So yeah, by the time I upload this video, that'll be there. So join the Discord, link in the description below, and we will bet darts over the Christmas period, because it's a brilliant, wholesome, very fun sport to watch with high drama, high stakes. And the sport, you know what I really love about darts? It's a sport where basically anyone can take part. Literally anyone can take part. So, you can't go and join the NFL and become, a multi-millionaire playing in the NFL. You can't do that, you know what I mean? Unless you go through the whole process from a very young age, the ship sails, you can't do it. But if you wanted to start playing darts tomorrow, within 5-10 years, you could be in the World Championship and you could become a millionaire, which is crazy. And because of that, I do get kind of Hunger Games vibes from darts. It's almost like a reality TV show in many ways. Very cool. So get involved, because obviously there's not much UFC over the Christmas period. So if you're looking for sports to watch, looking for sports to bet, darts is a great option. Check it out. We love the darts. Okay, so like I say, it's going to be a very busy weekend. loads of football to bet over the Christmas period. Join the Discord, get involved, join my community, get involved. We're going to have a lot of fun. We make a profit every year on everything that we do. You know that by now. And let's jump into our bread and butter, where it all began. Before we started dabbling in darts and football, let's go back to where it all began, betting on the UFC. And we're going to kick things off by breaking down the main event of this weekend's card, which is going to be Colby Chaos Covington. Try saying that after a few pints of beer. And Joaquin Buckley. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Joaquin Buckley is the favourite at average odds of about 1.40, which is going to be minus 250 for an implied probability of 71%. If we take a look at the odds on Covington, he's around an average of 3.05, which is going to be plus 205 for an implied probability of 33%. So Covington is 36 years old, and what I actually didn't realise until I started researching this fight, I know that Covington is obviously getting older, but I didn't actually realise that he was going to be 37 years old in just a couple months' time. I thought he was like 35, 36, which he kind of is. He is 36 years old, but I didn't realise he was like 37 in a couple months because, you know, 35, 36 is getting old for a welterweight, but when you get into that 37, 38, 39-year-old kind of bracket, everything quite often changes, and there's a big difference between being 37 and 35. On paper it's only a 2-year age gap, but the amount that, you know, a male athlete's athletic performance can decline in those 2 years between the age of 35 and 37 is usually pretty massive, which goes a long way towards explaining the kind of change we've seen in Colby Covington's I guess approach to fighting and style of fighting in his last couple matchups. I do think Father Time is potentially hitting Colby pretty hard, which is to be expected after such a long wrestling career, 21 pro MMA fights, and with him now being the age of 37. This is not me calling Colby old or anything like that, because I'm older than Colby. I'm 40 years old, but Colby at 37 unfortunately does not have time on his side any longer, which would explain the sudden shift in his performance. So he is 5'11 with a 72-inch reach compared to Buckley, 30 years old, 5'10 with a 76-inch reach. So we can see both these guys are, you know, at different stages in their careers, right? Colby on that downward trajectory, Buckley on that upward trajectory, and there's a 7-year age gap in this fight. We know that the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time when there's a 7-year age gap in a fight. So obviously, that's a statistic that heavily favours Buckley. If you were to just blind bet that statistic over the long term on fights like this, it would be a negative EV bet because Buckley's implied probability at odds of 1.40 are just 71%, so you'd be giving up like a 4.5% margin there, which would make that a bad bet. But obviously we haven't considered all the other stuff in this fight in terms of how both these guys match up from a stylistic point of view. On top of that, Buckley has a 4-inch reach advantage, but he doesn't really do a very good job of using it, and we'll explain why when we get into how these two match up when it comes to striking. So I don't think the reach advantage for Buckley is going to be that big of a deal here, and a 4-inch reach advantage in statistical terms is a bit of a marginal edge. It's nothing too major. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, classic striker versus grappler matchup. Colby coming from that NCAA Division 1 level wrestling background, Buckley an explosive striker. Although this is mixed martial arts, most fighters dabble in a bit of everything, and what is super interesting about both Colby and Buckley is that Colby, obviously in the later stage of his career, evolved into more of a striker, where over the last few years we haven't really seen him grapple that much. And Buckley, on the other hand, started as a pure striker, and now in some of his recent fights against Stephen Thompson and Ruzaboev, we're seeing him use much more grappling heavy game plans. So Buckley is evolving, Colby is as well, possibly to his detriment, but that's the situation we're in at the moment in 2024. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, before we talk about the striking and grappling, it's really important to go into some depth on Colby Covington's potential decline, because at the end of the day, we know this is a young man's sport. 37 years old is pretty old for a welterweight, and Colby has shown signs of significant decline in some of his recent fights. Now, when you look at Colby's career, what I find interesting about him is his style that he built his career off is a style that generally an older fighter will still be able to utilize, even past the point of significant decline to some success. Because Colby's strategy never relied on like speed or reflexes or athleticism, which are some of the first things to go as you get older and start to decline. Colby's entire style of fighting came down to cardio, toughness, and just that relentlessness, right? And you can see older fighters still use that strategy with some success. Probably the greatest example would be Glover Teixeira, right? Where he evolved from a striker to a grappler, but his cardio and his toughness and his relentless style of grappling was what enabled him to add longevity to his career. So Colby's in this weird spot where he started out with this relentless style of grappling with, pretty legendary cardio. Then he evolved into a striker, but I feel like now he needs to go back to his bread and butter. Now he needs to go back to the style that got him to the dance. And if he does that, I actually think he could have a bit of a career resurgence. I'm not saying he can beat guys like, Rakhmonov or Bilal Muhammad, but he can certainly cause guys like Leon Edwards. Yes, I know Edwards has just beaten him, but he can certainly cause guys like Buckley a problem, etc. Because if Colby grapples more, he is going to be difficult to deal with. And the reason why he lost to Edwards is that he just didn't grapple very much. So this is one of those fights where how competitive it turns out to be and what chances I give Colby of winning really depend on what version of him we get, what game plan and strategy he implements. Because the Colby we've seen in his last fight against Leon Edwards and in recent fights has looked very gun-shy. He hasn't grappled very much. He hasn't looked very physically imposing in grappling positions. And he's kind of just tried to stand and strike and win boxing matches against far superior strikers, which again is the reason why he lost to Leon Edwards. But if Colby rolls back the years, utilizes his game plan and strategy that got him to the dance, got him into the top 5 title picture in the first place, I actually think he can cause Buckley a lot of problems. Now, when we look at what the probability of Colby performing like that is, it's not particularly good in my opinion, because usually when you start to see a fighter look timid and gun-shy and way less aggressive than they were earlier in their career, usually it is one of the first signs of a steep decline due to age. And with Colby now being 37, those days of that relentless, flat-out style of grappling are probably behind him. What I would also say about Colby is that he suffered a broken jaw in 2021 in his fight against Kamaru Usman. A broken jaw is one of the most devastating injuries that a fighter can suffer, and it quite often changes them forever. Once a fighter breaks their jaw, they never recover. And even though physically they may recover, psychologically they're never as confident or as aggressive or as durable as they used to be. So I do think the broken jaw in the Kamaru Usman fight was probably a turning point for Colby, where before the Usman fight, he was Colby Chaos Covington, right? He was standing in the middle of the octagon, put a lot of pressure on his opponents, look to get into big exchanges and break them down and wear them down with his high volume aggressive style. But we've definitely seen a different style, a different side of him in his last 2 fights against Masvidal and Edwards, where he's a lot more timid, a lot more gun shy, and that takes away a lot of the things that made Colby so great to begin with. That means in the context of this fight, that if Colby comes out very timid and gun-shy, like he has done in his last 2, Buckley is going to outstrike him, and he's going to win this fight easily. When it comes to striking, Colby's never had much power in his hands, so he's not really got the power in his hands to get respect in there from Buckley. And while Buckley's not a particularly technical striker, he's very aggressive, he hits very hard. Now, earlier on we were talking about reach not really having much of an impact on this fight, and that's because Buckley's one of these guys that likes to be all the way outside of a range where he can be hit, or all the way on the inside, blitzing forward with like straight punch karate combinations, or attacking with takedowns. Because of that, Buckley doesn't really use his reach, because he's either too far outside of a range where he can use the reach, or he's right on the inside fighting in a phone booth. So reach probably isn't going to play a factor here. But because Colby doesn't have the power in his hands to punish Buckley for his recklessness when he comes forward with those blitzing attacks, Buckley can kind of come forward with reckless abandon in a way he couldn't really do with Stephen Thompson because of how dangerous of a counter-striker Stephen Thompson is. So if this fight stays standing, even though Buckley is sloppy and reckless on the feet, I think he's going to just fucking totally cakewalk it. It's going to be a walk in the park for Buckley on the feet. I don't think Colby's going to get any respect in there. I think this will be a very easy fight for Buckley if it stays standing. But what about if we get grappling in this fight? Well, Colby is a former NCAA Division 1 level wrestler, but he's not the best offensive wrestler in terms of takedown entries and grappling control. So Colby's a bit more like a Merab where he doesn't have the best grappling control. He doesn't have much physicality to his grappling. But the benefit to the lack of physicality is that he's obviously got legendary cardio in the same way that Dvalishvili has to continue to spam takedowns relentlessly for 5 rounds. So Colby's offensive wrestling is not as good as Dvalishvili's, but his cardio is obviously top tier. So that makes this fight kind of interesting because Buckley will be difficult to take down and hold down. He's got that low center of gravity. He's strong. He's muscular. He's got that good takedown offense. He's got great balance. But we have seen situations in the past where Buckley is tired a bit and is worn down. It happened in the Abdulrazak Al Hassan fight. Happened a bit in the Stephen Thompson fight, even though I know he got a 3rd round finish. If you go back and watch that fight, Buckley was looking a bit tired just before the finish came. And so this is one of those matchups where if Colby does come out and grapple relentlessly in this fight, like he used to, I do think he can wear Buckley down and sneak a decision. He could backdoor a decision in the 3rd, 4th and 5th rounds. The early rounds of this fight are going to be difficult for Colby because he's going to struggle to build any momentum on the feet with striking, and he's going to struggle to take Buckley down and hold him down early until he wears Buckley out. But if Colby persists with that style, I think it'll pay off big time in the 3rd, 4th and 5th round. But if we look at this fight in terms of betting, we've got to be dealing always in terms of most likely outcome. And the last time we saw this style of fighting from Colby Covington, I would say personally, was all the way back in 2020 against Tyron Woodley. So it's been a long time since we got that aggressive, relentless style of fighting. It's been 4 years, and Colby is getting older and older with every fight. So most likely outcome this weekend is Colby fights in a similar way to how he fought Leon Edwards. Timid, gun-shy, passive, low volume, barely uses any grappling. And if he fights like that, Buckley should win easily. Now, from a betting point of view, what does this mean? Well, for me personally, it means that Buckley is unplayable in this odds range. An implied probability of 71%. In order to bet Buckley, and in order to bet any fighter in this odds range, they have to have virtually no way to lose. Because when you're dealing in those, 70 to 75 to 80% implied probability ranges, you should only be betting fighters in that odds range if the only way the fighter loses is if something insanely improbable that you can't account for happens. That isn't the case here because we know if Colby comes out, grapples relentlessly, which he's capable of doing, he will likely cause Buckley big problems. So Buckley in this odds range is a pretty bad bet in my opinion, and I've got no interest in betting him. On the flip side though, if we look at the odds on Colby, 3.05 plus 205 for an implied probability of 33%. I'm not that interested in this either because if we bet on Colby, we've got to basically bet on a 37-year-old fighter performing in a way that he did 4 years ago, which is very unlikely because older fighters get worse. Older fighters find ways to lose. We know this to be true. So this is one of those fights where Buckley should win. There's no doubt about that. He is most likely to win, but I don't see where the value is here. I feel all of Buckley's advantages and Buckley's chances of winning are very much reflective in the odds. There's just no value here. The odds are where they should be. So in terms of the over-under on this one, obviously both these guys are kind of decisionators. You can see that Colby has been to a decision in the vast majority of his fights over the last 8 years, and the 2 that ended inside the distance ended extremely late and almost went the distance. And you can see that Buckley frequently goes deep in fights as well. So very likely this one goes deep as well. To be honest, the odds on the overs are all a bit too steep for me. They are all a bit too steep. I wouldn't be touching them. So in terms of the most likely outcome, that's going to be Buckley by decision, but the odds are pretty terrible. So that is looking like a dead fight for betting for me. So let's move on and talk about the next fight, which is going to be Billy Quarantillo against Swanson. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Billy Quarantillo is the favourite at average odds of about 1.65, which is going to be minus 154 for an implied probability of 61%. And if we take a look at the odds on Swanson, he is going to be around an average of 2.25, which is going to be plus 125 for an implied probability of 44%. So Quarantillo was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet on this week's card, and I definitely still lean towards him, but after researching this fight, I ended up liking Quarantillo a lot less than I thought I would. So let's dive into the tail of the tape, and I will explain the reasons why. So Swanson is 41 years old, 5'8", with a 70-inch reach. Quarantillo, 36 years old, 5'10", with a 70-inch reach. So both guys are about the same size. Quarantillo a little bit longer and taller. Swanson a little bit shorter, more muscular and more compact. But the real talking point here is the age of these guys and where they're currently at in their careers. So we can see that Billy Quarantillo is about 5 years younger than Swanson, which is very significant at this stage in their careers. So we know statistically the younger fighter wins around 65% of the time when there's a 5-year age gap in a fight. So if we put in Quarantillo's odds, that gives us an implied probability of 61%. So straight away, a bet on Quarantillo becomes interesting to me here, because we've got the age statistic that we can play, where we know if we just blind bet younger fighters when they're 5 years younger than their opponent, over the long term, those bets are going to win 65% of the time. So in that instance, you've got a nice 4.5% margin over the bookies. Obviously, we wouldn't recommend blind betting on anything. We want to look at how these two match up stylistically. But if you're going to bet anyone on this fight, it has to be Billy Quarantillo. You would be crazy to bet Cub and try and fight that trend. Having said that, even though the age statistic is 65%, you've got to remember that that is an average. So that's when 25-year-olds fight 30-year-olds, 30-year-olds fight 35-year-olds. And what these age statistics are really showing us is that this is a young man's sport. And when you've got older guys facing younger guys, the younger guy usually wins. But what we also know is the older the fighter, the more likely it is they are to lose. So if we had statistics, which we don't have, but if we did have statistics for how often 36-year-olds beat 41-year-olds, I would imagine the stat is actually far higher than 65%, because we'd be taking away all those fights from that data set where 25-year-olds fight 30-year-olds, 30-year-olds fight 35-year-olds, and therefore the true probability of Billy Quarantillo winning this weekend, purely based on the age stat, is probably far bigger than 65%, and therefore would give you an even bigger margin if you were to just blind bet Quarantillo at these odds. And even as I'm talking like this, I'm kind of talking myself into betting Quarantillo purely based on those statistics and perhaps not overthinking this one. But we will talk about how they match up stylistically, and then perhaps you can make your own mind up, and perhaps I can get over the line on betting Quarantillo too. So when it comes to age, obviously 41 years old is very, very old in any weight class, but it's especially old in the lighter weight class. In this instance, the featherweight division, because we know the lighter weight classes are all about speed, reflexes and athleticism, which are some of the first things to go as you start to get older. So Cub definitely in the tail end of his career, and this is one of those fights where you would expect Swanson to look worse than he has in the past. Having said that, things do get a little bit complicated with Cub Swanson, because obviously since the beginning of the year, there has been very little drug testing in the UFC since USADA has left the sport. Now, the UFC will tell you differently. More plates, more dates will say different things on the Joe Rogan podcast. People will debate this in the comments section, and they will have, very different opinions to me on the state of performance enhancing drug testing in the UFC. All I would say to them is the UFC are currently using the same company that does drug testing for the WWE. And I think that speaks volumes. This is an entertainment business. We know you get more exciting fights and more exciting fighters when they're allowed to use performance-enhancing drugs. We know it's healthier for fighters if they can use weight-cutting aids and aids to help or substances to help with their recovery when they become injured and things in training. And so I just have a feeling that the UFC drug testing isn't very robust at the moment. And there are countless examples that I can point to since the beginning of the year which show something weird is going on. Some of the weirdest performances would be Ovin St. Preux versus Kennedy and Chukwu. If you go watch OSP before 2024 and you look at him in that fight, very different. Jose Aldo versus Jonathan Martinez, another example. What the fuck's going on with Aldo there? And Swanson is another very good example. Swanson has obviously got ties to TJ Dillashaw and a camp which have dabbled in performance enhancing drugs in the past. So while I'm not accusing Cub Swanson of anything, there is no smoke without fire, and he does roll with some dudes that do dabble in the odd needle in the buttock. So in the case of Cub Swanson, this guy is a little bit fishy for me, because if you look at his performances against Jonathan Martinez and Hakeem Dawodu in 2022 and 2023, he looks like an old declining fighter whose reflexes are gone, whose athletic performance is gone, and just looks pretty shot in my opinion. Then if you look at his fight from the summer against Andre Fili, he looks like a completely different human. Looks significantly better, fights at a high pace, moves well, athletic, hits hard, explosive, all that kind of stuff. I have a feeling, this is just my opinion, I have a feeling Mr. Swanson could be on the secret juice, because it's unusual that you'd see a fighter at 41 years old improve, and I'm seeing Swanson look better at 41 than he has done in recent years. And again, people will disagree with me on this performance-enhancing drug issue. All I will say is, I've been watching the UFC for 20 years. I haven't missed a UFC event in the last 10 years. And I watch hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of fighting every year when I research these cards, which enable me to be profitable every single year on everything that I do. And I have been since day one. And I am just very observant to trends, very perceptive of trends. When you watch as much fighting as I do, you notice trends, you spot trends, and I just think the drug testing landscape in the UFC is very different at the moment, and I think Swanson may be dabbling a little bit here and there. So even though we do have those age statistics, when it comes to performance enhancing drugs, it does complicate things a little, and Swanson looked great against Andre Fili. If Swanson shows up and performs like he did against Andre Fili, I think he beats Billy Quarantillo, and that's where this fight gets real complicated. Because if Swanson performs like he did prior to the Fili fight, this is a good matchup for Billy Quarantillo. But if he performs like he did against Fili, I think he beats Quarantillo easily. And why is that the case? Okay, so if we think about the type of fighter that Billy Quarantillo is. So Quarantillo is one of these guys that has built a career off toughness, durability, and cardio. Similar to Colby Covington in many ways, although albeit very different styles. Fundamentally, their strategy and approach to fighting is the same. They're going to continue to come forward and look to break you with pressure, aggression, volume, and toughness, and they're going to bet on their ability to be tougher than you. They're going to bet on you not being able to keep up with the pace that they set, and they're hoping to drown you in the wave of pressure that they bring to you. And when you look at Quarantillo, he's very tough, fights at a high pace, reasonably well-rounded, can make you work hard wherever the fight goes, and he's got great cardio. So typically speaking, guys like Billy Quarantillo are going to cause these older guys like Cub Swanson big problems, because we know the fire goes as you get older. We know the durability goes as you get older. So when guys like Swanson, 41 years old, run into these relentless, fearless marauding, chaotic warriors that just want to come forward and drag them into a war, it's very, very difficult for these older guys to hang in there without getting broken and ultimately, getting finished or drowning in the pressure, right? So, typically speaking, Quarantillo would cause a guy like Swanson a problem. But Swanson's fight against Andre Fili was a war. It was a close back and forth competitive war with striking, with grappling, both guys taking damage, both guys getting tired, both guys fighting at a high pace. And Swanson did very well, actually. He hung in there and didn't really fade much at all. Arguably finished stronger and was very, very competitive throughout the entire fight with a very competitive, well-rounded opponent in Fili. So when you look at how these two match up, if the version of Cub Swanson that we get prior to 2024 shows up, I think Quarantillo is going to be able to come forward, drag Swanson into big exchanges, beat him up in the clinch, maybe hit some takedowns, and just generally wear Swanson down, overwhelm him, and overwork him, and outwork him to eventually get a win by decision or late finish. But the thing about Quarantillo, like a lot of these high-pressure fighters, like Colby Covington, like Tony Ferguson, like Nate Diaz, is that in order for their style to be effective, they've got to continually be able to come forward, hold the center of the octagon, and be durable enough to take damage to continue engaging you, so that whatever you hit them with, they continue to come forward, which continues to zap your energy, put you under pressure, force you to fight in an uncomfortable state of panic, and ultimately wear you down physically and mentally. That is fundamentally what makes Quarantillo, Ferguson, Diaz, Colby's style so difficult to deal with, because it's demoralizing to hit them with your best shots and see them continue to come forward. But obviously the downside of this style is that you do take a lot of damage, because ultimately you're constantly walking on the counter shots and taking damage and, getting beat up. And at some point in the fight, there's going to be a momentum swing where your opponent fades and then you can swing momentum in your favor. But to get to that point, you've got to take a lot of damage, which is why we've seen Nate Diaz take so much damage in his fights over the years. Same for Quarantillo, same with Colby Covington, right? It's very rare you'll see a guy like Colby or Diaz or Ferguson or Quarantillo go to a decision with anyone and not be busted up pretty bad and take a lot of damage. Even in fights they won, they take a lot of damage. So the problem with that for guys like Quarantillo and Diaz and Ferguson, etc., is that they do tend to decline pretty early in their careers because of how much damage they've taken. For a guy like Billy Quarantillo, he's had 24 pro fights. Billy Quarantillo's 24 pro fights isn't like someone that, may be very technical and very good defensively and hasn't taken much damage and might have 24 pro fights, or a grappler that might have had 24 pro fights. Most of these 24 pro fights, certainly the pro fights in the UFC, are going to have been absolute wars. So when you look at Quarantillo's recent performances, I do think we're seeing signs of decline in him, where he is getting rocked, wobbled, and dropped in almost every fight, whereas in the past, even though he would get hit a lot, he wouldn't be getting rocked and wobbled. He was very durable. And we're also in a situation now where he's not as aggressive as he used to be. He is way more gun-shy than usual. And what I want to do is show you a little clip from Quarantillo's fight against Damon Jackson, which was back in the summer of 2023. So obviously there's over another year of decline now in Quarantillo. And what I want to show you in this clip is how bad defensively Quarantillo looks in certain stages of a fight now. So this is the third round of the Jackson fight. Obviously, Quarantillo will be more tired at this stage in the fight, so he's going to look more hittable, worse defensively. But obviously, Swanson's a very dynamic striker, right? So just look in the final 3 minutes of this fight how vulnerable Quarantillo looks on the feet. Like, Jackson tags him clean and hard here. in this, like he's just walking on the right hands there, and Jackson's too tired to make him pay, too tired to hurt him. You know, Jackson's arms are heavy and tired, but you can see he's walking on the stiff jabs. Big uppercut there from Jackson. Jackson's too tired to hurt him, but you can see out in these striking exchanges here in the middle of the octagon how vulnerable Quarantillo is to counters. See how he just eats a big right hand there. And he's applying this, like, it's a big head kick there, big right hand there. You know, Jackson's absolutely gassed out and exhausted here. But he's landing clean, hard shots on Quarantillo. And he's tagging him. And obviously, you know, Swanson's a much more dangerous, much more dynamic striker than Jackson. So now, if we bring up a bit of footage on Swanson, I'm going to bring up the late stages of his last fight against Andre Fili. So you can kind of see the intensity that Swanson still fought at late on. So we look at the last 2 minutes of this fight. So just pay attention to how much fresher Swanson looks than Damon Jackson. Bearing in mind this fight was also contested at a high pace. How much sharper Swanson is, how much more explosive, how much more unpredictable he is on the feet. You know, this is the very, very final stages of round 3. And just visualize how much Quarantillo may struggle with someone like Cub Swanson in front of him deep in the fight, as opposed to someone absolutely gassed out, sloppy on the feet with no power in their hands, like a Billy Quarantillo. You can see Philly's tired, so he's trying to disrupt the rhythm of Swanson. But in this fight, right, you can literally see 41-year-old Swanson is fresher than Andre Fili. And this wasn't the case just a couple of years ago. Look, he's walking him down, not really even breathing that heavily. Now you'll see Cub explode towards the end of the fight to try and steal the round. Look, because Philly's backing up and circling away, you don't see a whole lot of strikes land there for Swanson, but I think you can kind of see my point. Swanson looking much more dangerous in the deep stage of that fight than Jackson, and Quarantillo looking very sloppy. So this is one of those fights where at the end of the day you're only as good as your last fight. You know, your last fight gives us the most accurate representation of what we're likely to get from you in your next fight, okay? And based on their last fights, if we're just capping this fight purely based on their last performances, I would favour Cub Swanson here, because Quarantillo's not the best offensive wrestler, so it's not going to be easy for Quarantillo to hit takedowns. Swanson is a significantly better striker. I'd even say he's more durable at this stage in their careers. And Swanson's cardio is good enough to deal with the pace that Quarantillo sets. So if we're just looking at past performances, I would favour Swanson here. But it is possible that Swanson-Philly performance was just an anomaly. Didn't really make a whole lot of sense for a 41-year-old to look better than they had over the last couple of years. So if Swanson looks like he did in previous years prior to the Philly fight, then I think Quarantillo wins. So who takes this really very much depends on which version of Swanson we get. So perhaps I'm overthinking this. Perhaps I should just play the age statistic and I should just bet Quarantillo and not think about it too much. But it's very difficult for me to bet Quarantillo when I look at Swanson's last fight against Philly, because I know that version of Swanson will probably beat Quarantillo, which would make Quarantillo obviously a bad bet. So in terms of the over-under on this one, both are pretty tough, both are pretty durable. If you look at Swanson's record, you know, yes, a lot of his recent fights have ended inside the distance, but prior to that, he was a bit of a decision-ater, and he might be back on the secret juice now, which is an explanation as to why he would have gone to a decision in his last 2. If we look at Quarantillo, he frequently fights to a decision as well. So it's more than likely that this fight goes to a decision. However, like I say, Quarantillo is getting rocked, wobbled, and dropped in every fight now. Older fighters find ways to lose. Swanson, you know, has been finished a few times in recent years, so if he doesn't show up at his best like he did against Philly this weekend, Quarantillo's violent. He could drag him into deep water like he did against Alexander Hernandez and drown him. And with how bad Quarantillo is on the feet, how bad defensively he is, sorry, and how much he's getting rocked, wobbled and dropped these days, Swanson could easily knock him out as well, especially later on in the fight when both guys get tired. And we've seen how sloppy Quarantillo looked in that third round against Damon Jackson. So if I was actually betting on this to go to a decision or not to go to a decision, I'm not going to bet this, but if I were to bet this, I think I would actually bet on the fight not to go to a decision, simply because when you've got two guys like this that don't want to take a backward step, Swanson's not going to back off, Quarantillo's not going to back off, and it's unlikely we're going to get grappling in this fight because neither guy's really got the wrestling to take the other guy down and hold the other down for long. In a stand-up fight, both these guys are, you know, at stages in their careers where they're probably not the most durable, right? At 41 years old, in the featherweight division, you're probably not going to be that durable. We've seen Kape finished, you know, over the last few years quite easily in a few of his fights. You know, Quarantillo's getting rocked, wobbled and dropped in every fight. I would just look at this as a 36-year-old fighting a 41-year-old. They're both going to go to war. They're both going to go toe-to-toe. It's going to be a crazy fight. They're both going to take a lot of damage. Can a 36-year-old and a 41-year-old take that kind of damage and hang in there for 15 minutes with one another when there's unlikely to be any grappling sequences or clinch fighting sequences to run the clock down? Not that likely. So I think this is more likely not to go to a decision, but I'm not going to be betting it because both guys, you know, do frequently fight to a decision. So the even money odds range doesn't really get me excited in this one. In terms of the prop bets, most likely outcome, in my opinion, is Quarantillo by decision. But you know, the Philly fight definitely spooks me because that version of Swanson gives Quarantillo hell. Potentially a bet you could consider as well would be fight ends in round 3. Odds of 15.01 plus 1,400, simply because by the third round of the fight, Quarantillo might be tired, beat up, you know, taking a lot of cumulative damage, beating absolute bombs from Swanson, be too tired to defend himself. And the same applies to Swanson as well. So if a finish does come in this fight, I think it'll be late on because both guys are tough and they're more volume strikers than power strikers. But by the third round, that cumulative damage might have taken its toll on one of them. And as a result, one of them is more likely to get caught with a big shot and taken out of there. So hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Manel Kape versus Bruno Silva. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Manel Kape is the favourite at average odds of about 1.27, which is going to be minus 370 for an implied probability of 79%. If we take a look at the odds on Bruno Silva, he's around an average of 3.90, which is going to be plus 290 for an implied probability of 26%. So Kape is 31 years old, 5'5" with a 68-inch reach. Silva, 34 years old, 5'4" with a 66-inch reach. So both guys about the same size. Kape a little bit longer and taller, and we can also see about the same age. Silva a little bit older. Nothing too major in terms of the tail of the tape, but Kape does fight long, does use his length reasonably well, although there are a lot of issues with Kape. So this is one of those fights where when I look at the odds, they do feel very wide to me. Manel Kape is one of these fighters that for some reason the MMA community has kind of singled out as being pretty good, and I don't think his skill set reflect how high some people are on this guy. I'm not saying Kape is a bad fighter or anything like that. I just think that he is overrated, and this has often got an influence on the odds because people think this guy is better than he actually is. So this is one of those fights which I actually do think is very interesting from a betting point of view. I think Bruno Silva is a very live underdog, and I think this matchup could be way more interesting than the odds suggest. The main issue with Manel Kape, in fact, there's two big issues with him. And these two big issues mean that he's the kind of fighter that you can never feel confident in. I feel if you go back over the last few years and you watch any of my Manel Kape breakdown videos, I will always say the same thing about this guy, and it never changes. And sometimes it costs him, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes he gets away with it, sometimes he doesn't. But there are always going to be two major risk factors when you bet on Manel Kape. The first major risk factor is that his takedown defense is dreadful. It is getting better, but it is still very easy to take Manel Kape down. And he's also one of these guys that is very weak off his back. He's one of these fighters that at times, because he's athletic and he's got good balance, he does have good initial takedown defense. But if you chain wrestle a little bit, getting deep on his legs, persist a little bit with the takedown, this guy's very, very easy to get down. Whether that'll be an issue in this fight or not, I don't know, because Silva doesn't grapple that much. But Kape's takedown defense and ground game is very bad. Certainly, not at the level you'd expect for a guy in this odds range. The second issue with Manel Kape is that he's very passive and tentative at times. Sometimes we get a very aggressive version of him, like we saw against Felipe Santos. And then other times we get a very passive, low volume style from Kape, where he really doesn't do a whole lot. And so these two weaknesses do present opportunities for Bruno Silva, because Silva's reasonably good everywhere. He's a reasonably good grappler. He's got decent cardio. He hits hard, reasonably good striker. This is one of those fights where I actually think both guys are very well matched. Yes, Kape's more athletic. He's bigger. He's faster. He's stronger. He hits harder. But the issues with his grappling, and also the fact that his fight IQ is not the best. He doesn't do a very good job of putting his stamp on rounds. He doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes in a lot of his fights. Make this a very winnable fight for Silva. So, yeah, Silva is a very tempting bet for me this weekend. I haven't bet him yet, but this is one of those fights where I look at it and I go, wow, these odds look very weird to me. They're very wide. I don't understand why Kape is this big of a favourite here. Yes, he's a bigger name, but in terms of the skill set, in order for a fighter to deserve odds like this, they shouldn't have any significant weaknesses that their opponent could potentially exploit. That's simply not the case here. And to be fair, it's not the case with anyone that Kape could fight in this division. So yeah, this is an interesting one. If you like the bet dogs, Silva could be one to look for. So in terms of, the over-under on this one, both these guys do have knockout power. They do hit hard. If you look at Kape's record, does have a couple wins by knockout. Silva got a couple wins inside the distance in his last two as well. Got another knockout here. He's won his last 4 fights inside the distance. Both are tough. Both are well-rounded. You do see the odds favour this fight to go to a decision. The majority of fights in the flyweight division do go to a decision. Obviously, the lighter the weight class, the more likely it is a fight will go the distance as a general rule. But with how dangerous these two are on the feet, with the fact this is likely to be a stand-up fight, with how many finishes they've both got recently, when you look at the odds, while I don't feel particularly confident either way on whether this fight will go to a decision or not, this is one of those spots where if you do want to bet the over-under, I think you have to just let the odds do the work for you. The odds are pretty steep on the fight to go to a decision, so in my opinion, at slight underdog odds, betting on fight not to go to a decision gives you a far better risk to reward ratio. In terms of the props and most likely outcome, Kape by decision, most likely outcome is the only prop I would consider on this, because if you did want to bet something Silva related, there would be no point in getting greedy and betting Silva by decision, because in percentage terms those odds aren't that much better than just betting Silva moneyline. So if you do want to bet this fight, I would say it's a clear dog or pass fight. You've got to take Silva. But this is one of those situations where even though the odds are closer than they should, even though I think the fight is likely to be more competitive than the odds suggest, if Silva wins, it's going to be a nice big winner. But at the same time, it's not like I can give any clear specific ways in which I think Silva's going to win this fight. I just think it's likely to be more competitive than the odds suggest. But if you bet Silva, that doesn't really help you if he loses. So do your own research on this one. Let me know what you think. It's an interesting fight, to say the least. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Vitor Petrino against Dustin Jacoby. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Petrino is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.30, which is going to be minus 333 for an implied probability of 77%. If we take a look at the odds on Dustin Jacoby, he's around an average of 3.60, which is going to be plus 260 for an implied probability of 28%. So Jacoby is 36 years old, 6'3" with a 76-inch reach. Petrino, 27 years old, 6'2" with a 77.5-inch reach. So both guys are about the same size, but we can see there is a very big age gap in this one. Jacoby will be 37 years old in the spring. So with that being said, there is a 9-year age gap in this fight, and the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. Not only that, but this is one of those situations where we really have the sweet spot for the ages. So like we were talking about in the Swanson Billy Quarantillo breakdown, obviously the age statistics are an average. So, you know, the statistic that the younger fighter wins 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight, that includes when 34-year-olds fight 25-year-olds. And the 34-year-old maybe hasn't started to decline that much. The 25-year-old is still a bit green. And so that is going to, you know, probably bring down the average of situations where we see young, hungry bulls like Petrino at 27 years old that are younger, healthier, more durable, going to be making big improvements from fight to fight, face these older guys who have taken a lot of damage, who have been in a lot of wars, and will be starting to decline. You know, Jacoby's had almost treble the number of fights that Petrino has, and I don't think that even includes his extensive kickboxing background. This is all MMA fights. So, you know, he's had a lot of MMA fights, he's had a lot of kickboxing fights, he's taken a lot of damage, and now that is starting to take his toll on Jacoby, because Jacoby went from being this tough, durable, high-pressure fighter that could just continue to come forward, block punches with his face and wear you down with pressure and volume and aggression in a similar way to Billy Quarantillo, to now someone that is getting rocked, wobbled and dropped in pretty much all of his fights. So at one point Jacoby was very durable, but we've now seen him get knocked out by Dominic Reyes in his last fight. He was wobbled twice against Alonzo Menafield. He was also wobbled against Azamat Mirzakhanov. And so Jacoby, similar to Billy Quarantillo, kind of built a career off toughness, durability, aggression, volume. But now that his chin is starting to let him down, it's hard for him to effectively fight with that style. Because, like we said in the Quarantillo breakdown, in order for a high-pressure fighter like Jacoby to be successful with that strategy, they've got to be able to hold the center of the octagon, throw a high volume of strikes, force their opponents to fight in a constant state of panic on the back foot, and just constantly force his opponents to engage. And when you do that, you leave yourself wide open to counter strikes. That's why guys like Quarantillo, Jacoby, Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson, Colby Covington, over the years when these guys have won decisions, at the end of the fight, even when they've won the fight, they've often taken a lot of damage. They're obviously usually busted up pretty bad. And so when the chin, when the durability of guys like Jacoby starts to go, that style becomes a lot less effective because they can't sustain that pressure and aggression any longer without obviously getting rocked or wobbled or dropped or knocked out, which is what we're starting to see from Jacoby. Because if you look at his fights against Mirzakhanov and Alonzo Menafield, he did outwork both Mirzakhanov and Menafield in those fights. He outstruck both guys. But because he was wobbled or dropped, you know, in those rounds, which ultimately enabled Mirzakhanov and Menafield to steal those rounds with being knocked out and wobbled, we're now in a situation where, you know, back when Jacoby was very durable, you know, he would be winning all these decisions, right? He would be winning all these decisions because he would be durable enough to take people's shots and continue to come forward. But now, even though he's still outstriking guys like Mirzakhanov and Menafield, he's losing rounds because he's eating that big shot, which is the most significant moment in the round, and he's getting wobbled and dropped and that kind of thing. And so with Petrino, we know he hits hard. We know he's a power puncher. He doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes. He's not going to be able to match the volume of strikes that Jacoby brings to the table. But with how bad defensively Jacoby is, with how easily he's getting rocked and wobbled these days, Petrino looks pretty tough. He looks pretty durable. At some point in this fight, or multiple times in this fight, similar to Menefield, similar to Mirzakhanov, you'd think Jacoby would get wobbled or knocked down or knocked out, which obviously makes it very difficult to win this fight and win rounds. What we've also seen from Jacoby, particularly in the Mirzakhanov fight, is that he is starting to become a little bit more gun-shy than usual. So prior to the Mirzakhanov fight, he was very aggressive, fought at a high pace. He would sprint for 15 minutes without slowing down. But he started very slow against Mirzakhanov, didn't throw as many strikes as he usually would until the second half of the fight, and by then he was already down 2 rounds. He then went back to his aggressive self against Menefield and got wobbled twice. So Jacoby might be in this period at the moment where he's struggling to find himself, because if he fights safer and smarter than he usually does, he risks getting outpointed. And if he goes back to like his old aggressive self, he risks getting wobbled, knocked out, knocked down. So Jacoby's in an awkward position at the moment, because if he comes out the gate super hard, super aggressive, fights at a high pace against Petrino, that could be an effective style, because Petrino isn't going to be able to match his volume, and with him being big and muscular, we may see Petrino wear down as the fight goes on. We know Jacoby's cardio is legendary, but at the same time, he could eat a big shot, get knocked out when he draws Petrino into these exchanges. But then if Jacoby does fight more cautiously, safer, smarter, focuses more on defense, Petrino hits a lot harder than he does. Jacoby's really just a volume striker. He doesn't inflict much damage, and so in that instance, Petrino would be landing the harder, more damaging shots, which would again make it hard for Jacoby to win this fight, win rounds, win a decision. So Jacoby's in a tricky spot here. Again, similar to the Kape versus Silva fight, how you bet this fight is an IQ test, right? It's quite simple. You'd have to be crazy to bet Petrino as a big favourite. There's just no value there. We know he's low volume. We know Jacoby fights at a much higher pace, right? The odds are just not worth the risk. Yes, younger fighters win 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. But even though that's a very high statistic, high probability, if we put Petrino's odds into the implied probability calculator, they come out at 78%. So that's actually, if you just blind bet that age stat, that's a negative EV bet. You're giving up like a 7.5% margin to the bookie. So this is a fight where if you really want to bet this fight, you have to take Jacoby. It is dog or pass. It is possible he could outwork and out-hustle Petrino and outpoint him and take advantage of Petrino's low-volume style, right? Jacoby is the right side to be on. His odds give you a better risk-to-reward ratio. But like I always say, if you do bet Jacoby in this fight, you are putting your money in a lot of danger, because you know 70% of the time he's probably going to lose. It's far easier to make money in this game when you bet with strong trends in your favour. We want to be finding situations like when we bet Elise Reed to beat Jessica Penne a few weeks ago, where we can get a combination of a fighter that matches up reasonably well against their opponent and has strong trends, like a strong reach trend or a strong age trend, in their favour. There's a reason why Jake Paul to beat Mike Tyson was my biggest pre-fight bet of the year. Very simple, right? Guys in their 40s don't beat guys in their 20s very often. Extremely rare. Very, very rare. Probably happens less than 10% of the time. I haven't got the exact stat, because it's very rare that guys in their 50s fight guys in their 20s. But when it happens, the guys in their 20s almost always win. So we want to be very patient and look for spots like that. We don't want to be betting on these old guys against young, hungry bulls. Yes, Jacoby may win this weekend, but it doesn't happen very often. So you are putting your money in a lot of danger if you gamble on him. In terms of the over-under on this one, This is one of those fights where, yes, Jacoby has looked very chinny. Yes, he was knocked out against Dominic Reyes. But Jacoby is so tough that he is one of these guys that you have to practically kill in order to beat. Or in order to finish, I should say. So Petrino is tough. He is durable on the feet. I know he got caught in a bad position against Smith and submitted. But we've seen him in some wars on the feet, eat some big shots. He looks pretty tough. He looks pretty durable. On top of that, Jacoby doesn't really have knockout power. He's more of a volume striker. It's the reason why he goes with decision so often. Yes, he has the odd knockout here and there. But for the most part, he is a volume striker. So I don't think it's that likely that Jacoby would finish Petrino. Now, it is possible that Petrino could finish Jacoby. But in order to do that, he's going to have to knock him out cold, send him to the Shadow Realm. Because Jacoby's one of these guys that will keep fighting till his last breath. Like I say, he was wobbled twice against Menefield, managed to hang in there, fight still went to a decision. Was hurt bad against Mirzakhanov, managed to hang in there, go to a decision. We know Khalil Roundtree is a beast on the feet. Jacoby was able to hang in there for 15 minutes with Roundtree as well. So, personally, again, you've always got to let the odds do the work for you. If I was betting the over-under on this one, personally, I would prefer to take fight goes to a decision. Not necessarily because I think that's the most likely outcome, but because I think the odds give you a far better risk to reward ratio than betting on fight not to go to a decision at pretty steep favourite odds. Because not only is it unlikely Jacoby finishes Petrino, and it won't be easy for Petrino to finish Jacoby because of how damn tough he is, you've also got to look at another scenario which could see this fight go to a decision, and that's the dynamic that Petrino at times doesn't do a whole lot. He's quite a low volume passive striker, and we've seen a more cautious, slower start from Jacoby against Mirzakhanov. So with him coming into this fight on the back of a pretty brutal knockout at the hands of Dominic Reyes, if we have a combination of Jacoby starting slow, fighting more safer and cautiously than usual, and we get a passive, tentative performance from Petrino, that combination of tactics from both guys could see this be a bit of a bore fest, be a bit of a boring fight, and actually creep towards a decision. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it would be more likely to happen if this event were in the Apex Center, but the crowd in Tampa, Florida, do get pretty wild. They do get pretty crazy, and the fighters are likely to, or more likely to, feed off the energy of the crowd. You know, the fights on the main card, the crowd are going to be litty. They're going to be up for this one. More than likely, these two are more aggressive than they would be in the Apex, but you know, personally, again, let the odds do the work for you. It's an IQ test. You know, don't take this as steep favourite odds. You know, take the odds with the better payoff, right? It's a no-brainer. In terms of most likely outcomes for the props, again, I will say the same about this fight that I said about the Silva Kape fight. You know, Jacoby by decision at 6.0 plus 500 is interesting to me. But in percentage terms, the odds aren't a whole lot better than just Jacoby moneyline. So don't complicate things. Don't get greedy. If you really want to bet this fight, just go dog or pass Jacoby. But personally, I would pass on this one. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down one of the most interesting fights on the card, which is Adrian Yanez versus Daniel Marcos. So let's start off by taking a look at the odds. We can see that Daniel Marcos is the favourite at average odds of about 1.45, which is going to be minus 222 for an implied probability of 69%. If we take a look at the odds on Yanez, he's around an average of 2.75, which is going to be plus 175 for an implied probability of 36%. So Yanez is 31 years old, 5'7", with a 70-inch reach. Marcos, 31 years old, 5'7", with a 69-inch reach. So both guys virtually identical size, virtually identical age. So we can get right into the breakdown on this one. So this is an interesting card because I feel you've got a lot of flawed fighters that are very big favourites. Guys like Manel Kape, Vitor Petrino, Navajo Stirling, Daniel Marcos, Michael Johnson, Yoel Alvarez, Felipe Lima, Miranda Maverick, Josephine Knutson. These are all very big favourites, and many of the fighters that I've just mentioned, Joaquin Buckley as well, have pretty big vulnerabilities that their opponents can potentially exploit. So we are going to see some upsets on this weekend's card. We are going to see some big underdogs win. Maybe we get a lot of underdogs win. Maybe only a few underdogs win. But whenever you've got a situation where a lot of big favourites are deeply flawed and should not be big favourites, you're going to get some interesting fights, some chaos and some upsets. And this could be one of those fights where that happens. Now, to be fair, out of all the big favourites on this card, Daniel Marcos is one of the more solid ones, one of the safer options. However, there are some issues with him in his past fights, and he is a little bit inconsistent, which does make this a very, very winnable fight for Adrian Yanez. So straight away, if we talk about how these two match up stylistically, it's unlikely we're going to get any grappling in this fight. Both are pure strikers. I don't think I've ever seen either of these shoot a takedown. In fact, could be wrong. I think Marcos might have shot a late takedown on John Castaneda, but it's very, very rare you'll see either of these guys shoot a takedown. This is probably going to be a stand-up fight. Very high level, technical stand-up fight. I'm really looking forward to this one. So, where do we even begin? It's a complex fight. So, in terms of how these two match up when it comes to striking, the one difference you really notice about these two is that Marcos is far better defensively. So Yanez is one of these guys that likes to put a lot of pressure on his opponents, likes to draw them into exchanges, likes to force them to engage. And because of that, similar to what we've spoken about with Colby, Covington, Dustin, Jacoby, Yanez is another guy that puts himself in the firing line. Now, Yanez is far more technical than those two fighters, but he does tend to take a lot of damage in this fight. That might not be a big deal against Daniel Marcos, though, because Marcos, even though he's also a very technical striker, he doesn't have much power in his hands. He's more of a volume striker. If you look at his record, he frequently fights to decisions. So with Yanez being such a high-level striker, he can kind of afford to eat some shots to get inside to land his combinations, because Marcos isn't really going to be able to hurt him much with his boxing. So Marcos is far better defensively. He moves a lot better. He's much harder to hit. But Yanez is much more dangerous offensively. Yanez has got true legit knockout power, lands mean, nasty, damaging, impactful shots, whereas Marcos can't really hurt Yanez as much on the feet. So if both guys do land, Yanez is the one that's going to be doing more damage, but Yanez might get hit more because he's worse defensively. So when it comes to boxing, Yanez actually kind of lean towards Yanez here, because ultimately if fights are scored on damage, Yanez should be the one landing the harder shots, doing more damage here. The problem with Yanez is that he's very bad defensively, and he just kind of tries to get through fights by overwhelming his opponents and just by being tougher than them. So he's not going to worry about, slipping a jab or eating a leg kick. He's just going to continue coming forward. And this does get him into trouble because he does tend to take a lot of damage in fights purely through cumulative volume. And one of the things that has got him into trouble in the past, one of the things that got him into trouble in the Jonathan Martinez fight, is because he doesn't check leg kicks, because he's got that heavy boxing style where he stands heavy on the lead leg. He's wide open to leg kicks. He doesn't really try and check them. He doesn't try and evade them. He just kind of takes them so that he can fight in that close proximity to his opponent and fight in that boxing range where he wants to be. This is pretty notable because Marcos, while he's not as skilled of a boxer as Adrian Yanez offensively, he does have a much better kicking game. And one of Daniel Marcos' biggest weapons are his leg kicks. So we saw Yanez stopped via leg kicks against Jonathan Martinez, and we know Marcos can inflict a lot of damage with leg kicks. He moves very well, he disguises them well, he can really dig in deep and hard with them. Marcos' leg kicks are no picnic. However, there is one issue with Marcos, which is ultimately the reason why I think this fight could be razor close and why I actually think Adrian Yanez is a very live underdog here. So one big issue in Marcos' skill set, and he doesn't always fight like this, but he does at times, is that, again, he can be quite passive and low volume at times. So Marcos is a guy that just looks to point fight and looks to just edge his opponents and just looks to kind of outstrike him in a nice friendly kickboxing match. But he doesn't do a whole lot of damage. He doesn't put a particularly big stamp on rounds, and he just doesn't land things that are particularly impactful. So while Marcos usually outstrikes guys, it's usually not by that big of a margin. He's only just kind of edging them. And that's dangerous against an aggressive guy like Yanez that will be more exciting, more aggressive, looking to land the bigger shots. So Marcos is one of these guys who can have a lot of success with leg kicks in this fight, but he's also a frustrating guy that sometimes doesn't throw as many leg kicks as he should. He's the kind of guy that might have a ton of success with leg kicks in round 1 and then just randomly stop throwing them in round 2. He's frustrating like that, which is a big opportunity for Adrian Yanez in this fight because he's the total opposite. Yanez is one of these guys that he's just going to come forward, get in your face, force you to engage, and he's going to sprint for 3 rounds. He's got the cardio to go hard for 3 rounds, and there's going to be no question as to whether Yanez leaves it all in there and does his best to put his stamp on rounds. So Marcos, very passive, very tentative, very technical. Yanez, scrappy, bad defensive, but an absolute warhorse. It's a great clash of styles, completely different approaches to striking. The chaos of Yanez, the technique of Marcos. I'm looking forward to this one. Again, let the odds do the work for you if you want to bet this fight. Do not bet Marcos as a big favourite. He's passive, he's tentative, he's the kind of guy that'll have you shouting at your TV to just do something if you bet on him. Again, this is an IQ test. If you're going to bet this fight, go dog or pass, take the underdog. You do not want to be betting $100 on Daniel Marcos and only making $44 profit, meaning you've got to hit a win rate of over 70% just to make a small profit on bets in this odds range. Use your brain and go with a fighter where you only have to bet $100 to make $175, $180 back in profit. It's a no-brainer. Let the odds do the work for you. It could be a very competitive fight. Yanez is no picnic. In terms of the over-under on this one, this is one of those fights where both guys are very tough, both are very durable, both have got great cardio. So that gives the fight going to a decision a reasonably good shot. However, at the same time, neither of these guys are going to back down. They don't like to take a backward step. They're going to constantly engage for 15 minutes because of how aggressive Yanez is, and he forces guys to engage. So whenever you've got two guys that want to go toe-to-toe, neither wants to take a backward step, and there's very little chance that the clock is going to be run down in this one with clinch work, ground fighting. It is dangerous to take the fight to go to a decision, in my opinion, because these two are going to be trying to take each other out for a full 15 minutes, and it only takes one shot to land for it all to be over. So, you know, I don't really have a strong feeling either way on fight goes to a decision or not because of how tough both guys are. My lean would be for it not to go to decision because I think this could be an absolute war where both guys feed off the energy of the Tampa Bay crowd, but I don't have a particularly strong feeling on that one either way. In terms of most likely outcomes for the props, again, I will say the same about this fight as many of the fights in this breakdown video this week. You know, Yanez by decision at odds of 5.5 plus 450 is interesting to me, but in percentage terms, his odds aren't a whole lot better than his money line odds. So just don't get greedy. If you really want to bet this fight, go dog or pass Yanez and don't bother with the props. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Alright, now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is going to be Navajo Stirling versus Tokkos. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that the debutant Stirling is a pretty big favourite at average odds of about 1.13, which is minus 769 for an implied probability of 89%. If we take a look at the odds on Tokkos, he's around an average of, say, 6.50, which is going to be plus 550 for an implied probability of 15%. So Stirling is 27 years old, 6'4", with an 82-inch reach. Tokkos, 34 years old, 6'4", with a 76-inch reach. So the age not too notable in this one, even though there's a 7-year age gap, which means the younger fighter wins around 67% of the time. Obviously, Tokkos at 34 years old isn't particularly old for a light heavyweight, so I don't think that age stat is that relevant here. What is relevant, though, is the very nice 6 to 7 inch reach advantage that Stirling has. He is a technical striker. He knows how to use his length. Tokkos is a pretty low-level striker. So that reach advantage for Stirling, adding to his already significant technical advantage on the feet, does help Stirling very nicely. Again, though, this is another fight where you've got to let the odds do the work for you. Stirling, the biggest favourite on the card. It's just ludicrous. Will he win? Probably. But does he deserve odds at an implied probability of like 90%? Absolutely not. You know, this at the end of the day, this is a cage fight to the death. Anything can happen. It's Stirling's UFC debut. He's only had 5 pro fights. We don't know much about his cardio. We don't know anything about his takedown defense and ground game. You know, this is not the type of fighter who should be in this odds range. It's very rare that any fighter in the UFC should be in this odds range. You know, again, this is an IQ test. Will he win? Probably. But if you really want to bet this fight, you simply have to let the odds do the work for you and take Tokkos. So, if we talk about how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Stirling's primarily a striker, which you'd expect because he trains as City Kickboxing. He's reasonably technical, nothing special to be fair, but he is a much more technical than Tokkos, who's more of like a blue collar, just gritty, grindy, well-rounded sort of grinder that is reasonably good at everything. Tokkos is one of these guys that doesn't really have any power in his hands, isn't that fast, isn't that good defensively on the feet, so Stirling will be able to outstrike him. Where this fight potentially gets interesting, though, is on the ground, because while Tokkos isn't the most skilled offensive wrestler, he does actively try to take his opponents down. And Stirling, training at City Kickboxing, coming from a traditional kickboxing background with only 5 pro fights, there is a pretty good chance that Stirling's takedown defense and ground game is pretty bad. Although because he's only had 5 pro fights, he hasn't really fought any fighters at the level of grappler who have really, you know, been skilled enough to take him down and potentially exploit that weakness. I want to show you a little bit of footage of Tokkos, though, because even though there is the potential for him to, you know, cause Stirling some problems with grappling, a big issue with Tokkos appears that his cardio isn't particularly good. So he may not be able to grapple hard for 3 rounds without gassing himself out bad. And because Stirling's an athletic guy with good balance, if Tokkos does start to get really tired, it might be very difficult for him then to continue to use his grappling heavy game plan, because he might not have the energy to do it, might not have the energy to get in on the legs of Stirling and take him down, even if Stirling's takedown defense does turn out to be pretty bad. The problem with Tokkos' cardio, though, is it is inconclusive, because what we can see is that the majority of Tokkos' fights over the last few years have ended in round 1. And the last time we got a really good look at Tokkos was all the way back in 2020 against T. Guerda in Bellator. And I want to bring that fight up very briefly here and just show you that is the wrong fight. I want to bring this up and show you how Tokkos was looking in the second half of this fight. So we're just going to skim through very quickly. So you can see straight away, you know, within the first sort of 10 seconds, Tokkos starts looking for a takedown. Not a particularly good offensive wrestler, but at least he's trying. We're going to skim through a bit more, because this video file is absolutely huge. It's just lagging a bit. Buffering, sorry. It's not the easiest to skim through. We'll go into round 2. Just for the most part, I want to show you Tokkos' cardio in round 2, but it's buffering quite a bit. You can see again, begin of round 2, commits hard to a takedown here. So you can kind of see if Stirling is one of these, you know, guys from a traditional kickboxing background with no takedown defense, very low level ground game. You know, you could easily see Tokkos out grappling Stirling. Like, even though Stirling's not a particularly good grappler, you don't have to be, you know, even though Tokkos isn't a particularly good grappler, you don't have to be if you're facing a guy with no takedown offense and no ground game. But anyway, the guy that Tokkos is fighting here does work his way back up to his feet, and then towards the end of round 2, you can see Tokkos just looking very tired here. So mouth open wide, slow hand speed, arms looking heavy and tired. You can see him looking very badly gassed here, throwing sloppy kicks, and as a result, it would indicate that his cardio is pretty bad. So even if Stirling does have bad takedown defense and does have a bad ground game, Tokkos still might not be able to out-grapple him because he might be too tired to grapple hard in the second half of the fight. And like I say, if Stirling's got good balance and is reasonably athletic, Tokkos might be too tired to take him down by that point. You can see he's very badly gassed here. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this Tokkos-Stirling fight. In order to bet a guy in this odds range, they have to have virtually no way to lose. That is simply not the case with Stirling. He's young, he's inexperienced. We don't know anything about his cardio, don't know anything about his takedown defense and ground game. So you'd be crazy to bet Tokkos in this odds range. This is clearly a dog or pass fight if you really want to bet it. Although, with how bad Tokkos' cardio is, you're not putting your money in a strong position if you do bet him. Okay, but obviously the payoff is huge in the odds. In terms of the over-under on this one, my lean would be on the over 1.5 rounds, just because based on Tokkos' last fight, you know he's going to go to his grappling early and often, which means he could run the clock down, you know, with some takedowns, some clinch control, which would edge the fight closer to that 7.5 minute mark. Having said that, we don't know anything about Stirling, so if Stirling's takedown offense does turn out to be really good, then you could turn Tokkos into a panic wrestler very quickly, knock him out very quickly. If Tokkos doesn't have any striking to compete with Stirling, and Stirling's takedown offense is good enough to prevent Tokkos from getting the fight to the ground. So I would prefer, out of the over and under 1.5 rounds, to take the over. 7.5 minutes isn't very long, but without knowing anything about Stirling's takedown offense and ground game, hey baby, okay, without knowing anything about, do you want to come here? There you go, Kiko, there's your ball. My dog has just shown it, or one of my dogs. I've got 2 dogs. Hey Kiko, babe. Okay, so we'll wrap this one up. I would prefer to go with the over. In terms of most likely outcomes for the props, Stirling to win by knockout or TKO is the most likely outcome, but obviously the odds are absolutely terrible on that. Some props you may want to consider on this one would be, I don't know what the odds are. Okay, so Stirling wins in round 3. There you go, babe. Stirling wins in round 3. The odds aren't very good on that. Stirling wins in round 3. The odds aren't very good. But I would be thinking about Stirling getting a finish in the second or third round based on the fact that Tokkos may be able to use his grappling and clinch work to survive in round 1. But then into the second and third round may become too tired to defend himself, and that's when Stirling can get him out of there. But I was hoping the odds would be a bit better than 7.0 plus 600 and 4.0 plus 300 respectively. So you might want to give that a miss. Those odds are pretty shit. So I hope you found those breakdowns useful. And Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Thanks for watching the video. Kiki, come here, babe. Oh, she doesn't want to come. Come here. She wants me to throw the ball. See, I was going to get her to say Merry Christmas to everyone. She's actually shown up right at the end of the video. Can you even see her? Kiki, where's your ball? I don't even know if you can see her. Anyway, boys, have a great Christmas. Happy New Year. Hope you all have an amazing time. I love you all. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back with another video soon. I'm going to do some different types of videos over Christmas and New Year's. And take care, everyone. Thank you very much. Nice one, guys. Bye. Kiko. Kiko.